In this lecture, we're going to take a little break from talking about kings and wars and stuff to talk about peasants and their daily life, the revival of trade in the Middle Ages from like 1000 to 1500, and the rise of cities. So from the year 1000 to 1300, the European population doubles. Why does it do that? For the most part, it's because of increased food production. They're making more food so you can afford to feed more people. What causes the rise in food production? This stuff's complicated, but essentially what you've got are the rise of these new stable nations that we talked about, right? England and France and all of them. And that sort of centralization provides the ability to grow more food. You also had some climate change involved. There's this thing called the medieval warm period. In a nutshell, temperatures were slightly warmer during this time than they had been, and it was better for growing food. And then in addition to that, advancements in technology. They had better farming equipment. They invent these, farming tools at the time. They invent these, the plows and stuff. Farming technology that lets them grow more food per acre. So what lets them grow more food? The same thing that lets us grow food now. A nice climate, better technology, and stable political environments. These are the things that you need to, grow a lot of good food. So where's this food being grown? Well, it's being grown on the manor, and so I got to tell you about the manor. The manor is this agricultural estate, essentially this big piece of land, right? It's got a castle or a big house where the Lord lives, and he employs a bunch of, some servants in the castle, but for the most part, the people he has are the serfs. The serfs are peasants, farmers, regular folks who are legally tied to the land. That is to say, they're not allowed to leave the land. And the serfs are the vast majority of Europeans, 60%. Most people are serfs. It's not like an even split at all. Serfs lead a very basic life. The whole family lives in a place that's one room, maybe two. They eat mostly bread. They, as a special treat on holidays, they'll eat a little bit of meat. So they've got a very sort of mundane existence. You've got pictures of them down there. All they just basically do is farm. They've got to work for the Lord. That's the Lord is giving them in return for his protection. They've got to give him, a bunch of their food. They keep enough to eat themselves. Now, they're not, though, slaves. They, have some degree of rights. The Lord has to protect them. He can't just sort of kick them out. But the Lord does have a lot of control over them. They're not allowed to move without his say-so. They're not allowed to marry someone outside of their particular manor without his say-so. So they're sort of half slaves. In addition, at this time, you see trade start to really increase. Cities like Venice, which you'll remember as the leaders of the Fourth Crusade, and Flanders, which is up in Northern Europe, become these big trading centers, really wealthy because they're starting to transition into a money economy. That is, an economy based on money rather than trading, right? Silver and gold are becoming very popular at this point, so people will trade for them. They'll trade anything for them. So gold and silver are becoming sort of the standard, like our dollar bills or whatever today. Also, once these things are getting more advanced and you're not just trading one sheep for one goat, you get what's called commercial capitalism. This is the system in which people invest in trade and goods to make profits. So it's like, all right, I'll travel to this faraway island. I'm going to buy a bunch of spices, and I'll bring them back. Now, taking it a step higher than that, in a commercial capitalistic society, someone else might invest in the guy going on the ship who's going to go get the trade and bring it back. And once you have people doing that, like investing in other things, that opens up a lot of possibilities because now people can sort of take more risks and do more interesting things. Speaking of taking risks to do interesting things, banks start showing up around this time to manage the exchange and sale of goods. Banks show up to hold people's money, to, again, invest in, someone who's got some crazy idea that they want to go, on this adventure and do something to get some money. Banks will do that, and that allows for, again, just a way more advanced, way more complicated economy and society. So banks are super useful for this kind of thing. Only problem is that loaning money at interest, so, loaning someone some, $100 and saying, all right, you got to pay me back in a year, but you have to pay me a little more than $100. So I'm trusting you to really do something with this 100. That's what loaning money at interest is. Hopefully that makes sense. Banks do that. That's how they make their money. But the problem is that's considered a sin by the church at this time. That doesn't stop banks, but what it does do is it impedes them somewhat, because it stops a lot of people from joining up who might otherwise have done so. But it doesn't stop non-Christians from doing this activity. And running banks is very profitable. So many non-Christians sort of go into the money lending business because they don't have a problem with it, and that is good for them, and it's good for everyone to have banks around. But what ends up being bad is it creates a couple sort of stereotypes that, it creates some prejudice, I guess, against sort of money lenders and people doing, these people who are doing the bank are bad in some way. So it creates some bad thoughts towards bankers that probably isn't fair. This time period also sees a bunch of cities coming up, and you can read most of this on your own, right? Essentially, just what you've got is the cities tend to sprout up near castles, because that's where merchants want to set up shop, because that's where a lot of the money is. They want to trade with the Lord. They want to trade with the people who live in the castle. So towns and cities typically pop up near castles. They're usually inhabited at first by merchants. The Lord sort of owes the town his protection, but it's not the same. They're not the same as serfs, much to the Lord's regret. They wish that they were like serfs, but they don't have total control over them. Towns have their own rights. They have their own little governments. And actually, a serf who escaped to a town and lived there for a year and a day got their freedom. They got to stay. So the cities, despite a bunch of problems they had, they were smelly, they didn't have very good sewer systems, they were prone to fires, they had all sorts of problems, but they had, a touch more freedom than you had as a serf. So they were popular for that reason. Now, in terms of industry in this period in the Middle Ages, industry was dominated by what are called guilds. There isn't such an equivalent of a guild today. They're sort of like unions. This would be, there'd be a guild for a particular industry. So like the guys you see here, there'd be like the Shoemakers Guild. And this is a group of shoemakers. It'd be all the shoemakers that would control the sort of production of shoes. They would set standards, be like, all shoemakers must do this, this, and this. They would determine how shoes were made. We're all going to make shoes this same way. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to make them. They all have to be, pretty good shoes. And they would set the prices. They did this so that not every shoemaker was in competition with each other. This way they could all make more money, because someone else wouldn't be undercutting them and selling shoes at a lesser price. So it was sort of this group, this industry group that controlled all of the shoe sales in a particular city. This may be sounding like a good deal to you, so you too may be wondering, how can I join a guild? Well, when you're around 10, you've got to become an apprentice. You would get assigned to a master. This is someone who's so good at making shoes. You'd be their apprentice, learn how to make shoes under them. After 5-7 years, you can graduate to become a journeyman. So you'd be just a worker, and you'd work for a craftsperson. You'd get paid. Apprentices don't get paid, but the journeyman would. Then, to become a master, you had to create a masterpiece, and that would be a shoe, right? Or whatever it is that you make. You'd have to create a perfect one of them, and then you submit it to the guild. And then the guild would judge your shoe, decide if it was good enough, and if they liked it, boom, you get to join, you get to be a member of the guild, live in the city, and lead a happy life in the Middle Ages.